Since 1914, world was in a constant state of war. A continuous conflict that raged from 1914 up until 1918. Even though this is technically a world war, most of the damages and casualties happened on European soil and around Mediterranean Sea. After 4 years of conflict, end of the war was near. A series of treaties between Entente and Central Powers have been signed. Bulgaria was first member of Central Powers to sign an armistice. That armistice was signed on 29 September 1918 in Thessaloniki, Greece. Second major armistice that was signed between the Central Powers and the Entente was the Armistice of Mudros. Armistice was signed on 30th October on the island of Lemnos and it ended fighting between the Ottoman Power and the Entente. Austria-Hungary was the next member of Central Powers to surrender and signed an armistice. Armistice of Villa Giusti that was signed on November 3rd ended fighting on Italian front. And finally, on November 11th, 1918, in Compiègne Forest, France, the last major armistice between the Central Powers and the Entente has been signed. These agreements forced Central Powers into immediate disarmament and surrender. However, a major peace treaty is gonna start being negotiated in 1919 during Paris Peace Conference. This conference is gonna last until 16th of January 1920 with inauguration of League of Nations. Even though other treaties have been signed during Paris Peace Conference, one treaty stands above the rest. However, today we'll be discussing a treaty that has had the greatest impact. A treaty that will not only shape the future of Germany, but also Europe and ultimately the world. To understand why the treaties were so punitive, we need to look at all losses and casualties caused by World War I. Casualties were absolutely immense. 8 to 9 million soldiers killed in battle or died by the effects caused by it. Over 21 million soldiers wounded. 78 million of prisoners and missing personnel. Plus massive civilian casualties caused by war. Of course, these numbers may vary, but important thing is, the damages and casualties caused in this war were not seen ever before. Besides civilian and military casualties, damages to infrastructure were unparalleled in any other war before. The places that were hit the most by the destructive forces of the war in the West were Belgium and France. Many villages and towns were destroyed. Industrial damages to France and especially Belgium were catastrophic. Before the war, the French territory that's going to be occupied by German forces during the war produced approximately 75% of all French coal production, 80 to 90% of iron ore and cast iron production, also between 60 and 80% of steel manufacturing capacity. All this amounted to a loss of approximately 14% of all French industrial capacities. To accommodate these losses, French opened thousands and thousands of small factories all around France. Those factories were manned by youth, elderly, disabled and women. It's also worth mentioning Algerian and Vietnamese laborers who brought in from French colonies to replace French mobilized troops. Agriculture in northern France was heavily reduced because of constant shelling, poisonous gas, and by thousands and thousands of kilometers of trenches built by both sides. Belgium was especially hit hard because Belgium was the most densely populated country in the world before the start of World War I. As a result of that population density, Belgium was in constant fear of famine throughout the whole war. Food market in Belgium was heavily disrupted by German occupation and subsequent British blockade. Even though certain agreements have been reached that will allow occupied Belgium to import food from Netherlands, that was still not enough to properly feed the population of Belgium. All of these things that were said meant high reparations were in place for the losers of the war. And that loser was Germany. At the start of Paris Peace Conference, it was clear who the main voices are gonna be. Voices that are gonna determine the contents of peace treaties signed during Paris Peace Conference are gonna be the leaders of UK, USA and France. All three leaders entered Paris Peace Conference with similar goals, which was punishment of Central Powers and maximum reimbursement of their losses, that would be paid by money, territory, or both by their enemies. One of those leaders was Prime Minister of UK David Lloyd George. He started as Minister of Munition, he then became Minister of War, and ultimately, in 1916, he became Prime Minister. As a Minister of Munition, he realized overhaul of industrial production was needed. He was also the one who addressed labor shortages and strikes by negotiating with unions. He also initiated introduction of women into workforce. All of these decisions successfully resolved the 1915 crisis when the army faced major ammunition shortages. He then briefly held position Minister of War, but he felt constrained by established military hierarchy. By the end of same year, he became Prime Minister of UK. He led coalition government of all major UK parties like Conservatives, Labour and Liberals, which he was a part of. We will see a similar situation during World War II, with Chamberlain and then Churchill leading coalition governments. He thought that softer, less punishing treaty is actually more beneficial to his own country and rest of Europe. But he also knew that he needed to satisfy populace of UK by properly punishing Germany. In the end, he acted as a mediator, as a more moderate voice compared to the more lenient USA stance and more punishing French stance. But he knew what his goals were for this peace conference. He wanted to ensure complete naval supremacy by reducing Germany's navy. He wanted to secure Germany's overseas colonies in British name, with ultimate goal making sure British Empire survives and it's protected. During peace conference, he wasn't the only one who thought harsher treaty is gonna lead to another war. Another member of British delegation shared the same sentiment. His name was John Maynard Keynes. Today, he is more known as someone who has fundamentally changed economic theory and economic policy. He was also British Treasury representative during Paris Peace Conference. He called this treaty Carthaginian Treaty because it was designed to completely crush its enemies, the same way Romans did after winning Punic Wars. He thought this kind of treaty is gonna have completely opposite effect. And with power of hindsight, now we know it was true. And then, American President Woodrow Wilson enters the scene. He was more focused on creating lasting peace through the League of Nations. And he thought more leniency towards the defeated nations should be afforded, especially Germany, because he saw Germany as a major factor in securing long-lasting peace. For 3 years until 1917, Wilson pushed for neutrality. And this neutrality lasted until Zimmermann Telegram and continuous unrestricted German submarine attacks. After American entrance into the war, he implemented industrial controls and war production measures. He created a committee on public information to build public support for the war. The committee was headed by George Creel, which utilized 4 Minutemen and pro-war posters to mold public opinion. Wilson also signed the Espionage Act of 1917 and Sedition Act of 1918 to suppress dissent and criminalize disloyal speech against the government. He started the conference with the goal of pushing through his 14 points that he thought were necessary for a successful post-war world. But some of those points clashed with certain views of his European allies. And those 14 points were: in the end, he had to make concessions and accept harsher punishments, which he did not approve of. But even then, he believed the treaty and the League of Nations were the only way forward towards lasting peace. French President Georges Clemenceau advocated for harshest penalties against Germany, which is understandable because neither USA nor the UK was actually invaded by Germany or actually bordered them by land. Neither of them ended up with millions of civilians displaced, villages and towns abandoned, and infrastructure destroyed. He wanted to make sure that Germany was never again in position to inflict such damages. He was also the one who even before the war believed Germany was gonna attack. He kept pushing for rearmament via his newspapers L'Homme Libre, which he founded in 1913 in May. Even though at the beginning of the war, papers were temporarily banned because of criticism against the government. But after a certain amount of time, papers were unbanned, and he was one of the first to draw public attention to war weariness, slackness, and anything that would harm the war effort. He was also the one who was pushing for America to enter war sooner and to be more involved with war effort. Just as UK Prime Minister David Lloyd George, he didn't start the war in position of Prime Minister, but he was asked to form a government in 1917, which he did, selecting himself as a Minister of War and as Prime Minister. After becoming Prime Minister, his primary goal was creation of unified military command. And as a result, in March 1918, Ferdinand Foch was designated sole commander. When it comes to the contents of the treaty, he actually thought Rhineland should not be demilitarized zone, but independent buffer state. He pushed for massive reparations to be paid by Germany, and he actually thought the final amount that Germany was supposed to pay was actually not high enough. And of course, he wanted the return of Alsace-Lorraine. He wanted German army to be disbanded and eliminated to prevent any future German attacks against France. In France, he was seen as president who was too lenient and didn't push for harsher treaty. And that leniency is thought to be one of the main reasons why he lost subsequent presidential elections. After he lost preliminary party ballot to Deschanel, as it was customary before election of new president, he resigned his premiership. He also gave up all other political activities and retired. Now that we have met all relevant political players in creation of this treaty, it's time to look at the contents of the treaty itself. It's also worth mentioning that defeated nations had no voice in shaping these treaties. Everything was completely dictated by the alliance and its leaders. German delegates couldn't do anything but accept unbelievably harsh treaty that was imposed onto them. Germany was required to pay 132 billion gold marks, which was around 32 billion US dollars in 1921. However, Germany struggled to pay these reparations, leading to a default in 1923, and subsequent economic turmoil including hyperinflation. In response to that, a new plan was implemented in 1924, restructuring Germany's payments and providing American loans to stabilize the economy. The Young Plan in 1929 was second attempt at restructuring Germany's World War I reparation payments, replacing the previous DOS plan. It cut Germany's reparation payments by around 20% and they were to be paid in the next 59 years. However, American banks began to pull their cash away from European investments in 1930s because of 1929 stock market crash. Without foreign loans, Germany's economy collapsed, and the country defaulted on its reparation obligations to UK, France, and other allies. They were also deemed responsible for starting the war, and allies made sure that war guilt clause was in the treaty. They aimed to ensure that Germany would never again become a military threat to Europe. And the treaty had many stipulations that would try and achieve this aim. German army was restricted to 100,000 men, and the general staff was eliminated. Production of armored cars, tanks, submarines, airplanes, and poisonous gas was forbidden. And only a limited number of factories was allowed to produce ammunition and weapons for the remaining German army. All of Germany west of Rhine River and up to 50 km east of it was going to be the demilitarized zone. Clemenceau wasn't able to push his idea of a Rhineland as independent buffer state. Treaty created unbelievable amount of resentment within German people, even though, as we have seen, some concessions have been made in subsequent years. Germans felt the treaty was too harsh and dictated to them. And as a result, this treaty undermined the new Weimar Republic. It was breeding ground for extremes from both left and right. And it was one of the major talking points for NSDAP, who took over in 1933 and ended Weimar Republic. We often treat history like a closed book. But Treaty of Versailles, like any other historical event, is not something finished. It lives in geopolitical shifts of Middle East, power dynamics of Europe, and the very structure of international law. We are still living in a world shaped by Clemenceau, George, and Wilson, with all its positives and negatives. The map has changed, but stakes haven't. The history didn't end in 1919 with the signing of the treaty. It just gave us tools to decide what happens next. When we look at modern day, we don't just see new conflicts. We are hearing the echoes of 1919 and other historic treaties. The question isn't how we ended World War I or II, but how to prevent the next one. The Versailles masterclass in the law of unintended consequences. It taught us that punishing defeated nations can be even more dangerous than the war itself. And that redrawing maps in the boardroom rarely accounts for the people living on the ground. As we navigate a new era of global tensions, Versailles stands as cautionary tale. The terms we set today are seeds of the world that we inhabit tomorrow. And that's why history explains our future.